Welcome to Climate Change with Scott Amyx. I'm your host, Scott, and today I'm joined by Stephen Erickson, who is an author and an environmental and animal activist. Thank you for joining us today, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, Scott, very much for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. So my first question for you is, what was kind of your earliest memory in terms of when you realized that protecting the environment was important?
You know, that goes back to my earliest memories. It goes back to tending my mother's gardens. She was an avid gardener and introduced me just to the beauty of plants and nature. And that stayed with me ever since. I've been an environmental and animal advocate and activist for 30 years. But my path really is in the entertainment industry. And as a screenwriter, when I'm writing a screenplay or when I'm directing a feature film or when I'm overseeing a home entertainment label, putting out a series of DVDs, I love to write and I love to tell engaging and entertaining stories.
So because of the span of your activism, 30 years or so, you've seen a lot that has happened in terms of environment and, of course, animal rights. Do you feel like, again, I'm talking more at a kind of global kind of trend perspective, do you feel like the level of activism has really made a difference? And if so, how?
It's made a huge difference. It's brought us a long way, from the first Earth Day and the EPA and everything that's happened. I'm a member of numerous environmental groups, and what we're accomplishing right now is tremendous, but it's not enough because we're facing the news we get every day now, the new scientific research is increasingly dire. We're facing human extinction from global warming later this century. So we have to move very, very quickly now. There's been tremendous progress and compassionate awareness over the last 30, 40 years, certainly since I got on board, but we now have to move very rapidly and decisively going forward.
So we've been having these climate change summits as an example throughout the years, and there is big goals in terms of the kinds of reduction around carbon footprint and greenhouse emissions. Yet, in terms of the data suggests that we've actually kind of gone up in terms of our emissions. Of course,
Yes.
At the time of this recording, with the lockdown. Because of the pandemic, we're in a completely different situation now, temporarily. But really, have we truly made a difference? And yes, maybe there is more awareness, certainly with the younger generation, but are we seeing the kind of traction that we should be seeing?
Not at all. Not at all. And I just checked this before the podcast. The parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere is approaching 420 right now. And we were warned about the dire effects of climate change if we cross the 350 threshold, which parts per million, which we blew past in 1950. So there's more carbon in the air right now than there has been in 15 million years. And the situation's increasingly dire, and it's increasing every year. There's just a lot that needs to be done, and it's just not happening quick enough right now.
Yeah, and just for fairness' sake, is that it's not that the planet doesn't produce carbon on its own. It does actually produce CO2 and other things. It just the acceleration or the speed and the velocity that it has happened has implications, and that's starting to show in the cases of rising sea levels, as well as increased intensity and frequency of wildfires and pattern changes in terms of climate and so forth. Let's get into your book, which you start to kind of delve into some of these big challenges. It's called The Great Healing: 5 Compassions That Can Save Our World. In it, you actually name a specific arch villain when it comes to climate change. Who or what is it?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book. First, I wanted to inspire hope and courage on this very subject because most of us remain unaware of who our arch villain is, as well as our singular solution. Our arch villain contributes 57% of all carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And our singular solution is there's only one existing way to draw down atmospheric carbon significantly. Our arch villain is big ag, which is big agriculture, and that's comprised of industrial agriculture and factory farming. And that by far and away is the most polluting industry on the planet. Our singular solution is soil's natural ability to sequester carbon, and that is regenerative agriculture, which is natural. It's farming organically, farming naturally, the traditional way, but doing it at scale. And my book lists 5 compassions, which is basically the path to achieving that solution at scale.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and of course, there are many contributors to the greenhouse effect, and certainly farming, especially when I take into account livestock as well as pesticides and the runoff that goes into the oceans for
Mm.
acidification. Huge implications. Um, how does regenerative agriculture, play into climate change in terms of the sequestration? And is there potentially a bit of catch-22 in terms of, in order to have regenerative capabilities, you need productive farms. But yet,
Yes.
because of the rising average temperatures, because of more severe drought, and because of more intensity and increase of wildfires and even pests that we're starting to see around, locusts and killer hornets everywhere that's destroying everything from just crop to honeybees, isn't that making it more difficult to run productive farms? And are we kind of at a point where we can't achieve one because of the issues that we've created for ourselves?
Well, first, understand that regenerative agriculture versus industrial agriculture, which is Big Ag's version, they're diametrically opposite. And regenerative agriculture is based on certain principles used in combination: cover crops, crop rotation, crop diversity, no pesticide use, minimal disturbance of the soil, animals return to pasture, and protecting the soil's internet. Industrial agriculture, Vandana Shiva, a renowned international soil scientist, calls them its collection of violent tools. And in The Great Healing, we talk about those tools, which are monocrop farming, pesticide use, synthetic fertilizers, water overuse, and basically farmer indebtedness, farm worker exploitation, and GMO seeds. And the key thing is they're diametric opposites. And this is the key thing why our arch villain, in addition to being the largest polluter by far on the planet, is our paramount threat to survival on this planet. And this is why industrial agriculture and its suite of synthetic fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides kill the soil. They eliminate the soil's ability to sequester carbon, which is our one solution. In other words, synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides, when they're applied to the soil, they kill everything: every weed, every insect, migratory monarchs, they kill our bees, migratory birds, they kill everything. And most importantly, they kill the earthworms and the rich microbiome of the soil. So industrial agriculture takes healthy soil sequestering soil and converts it into dead carbon releasing dirt. And because of that, they're our arch villain. They're our preeminent threat to global extinction this century is this one industry. And my book gets into the compassions or an evolution where if people understand compassion for animals and compassion for all living beings, then it gets into compassion for self. And if they understand healthy food and taking care of your body temple, and then they understand the beauty of industrial agriculture, but also how regenerative agriculture, but how to contribute over 1 million new jobs and revitalize our ravaged rural communities nationwide, because this has to be done at scale, but on small farms. And there's a demand for that product. But then they'll understand they can elevate compassion to the next level, which is our democracy, which we can maybe get into, but it's all about affecting change at the national level, because that's where all this really has to come. You asked originally about individual contributions and what progress we're making. Right now, the COVID epidemic offers a unique opportunity that we're seeing the world through a new lens. Things are much cleaner now. There's a lot less activity. And I think all of us realize the situation we're emerging from, the new reality, is going to be different from what it was before COVID. And I think it's a tremendous opportunity to enact policy like the Green New Deal and a new farm bill, which will actually take and shift the American economy into the growing $26 trillion global new economy. And that new economy is based on principles like sustainability, earth-friendly, humane, and just. And it's that shift that we need to do, and that's the evolution of the 5 compassions, because change has to happen at the government level. And a key thing about that, by the way, is it's nonpartisan. This is not a Republican issue. It's not a Democratic issue. Saving the planet is a human issue and a human imperative. And so my book outlines our arch villain, our solution, and the path to get there through compassionate activism. So that's why I wrote it.
So I think in terms of the power of regenerative farming, it's well studied, and of course, I'm very much aware of technologies and startups that's specifically addressing some of these areas, such as being able to reactivate the microbiomes to do what they were supposed to do. Before we started to use chemical fertilizers, as an example,
Yes.
or natural pesticides instead of having to use the harmful pesticides that not only wash away after a rain but it goes
Mm.
into the soil, the water tables, and eventually to the rivers and the oceans. So the power of the regenerative farming is huge, and of course we know of researchers that are working to deepen the root system. And by
Hmm.
deepening the root systems of plants and trees, that alone will more than sufficiently absorb the CO2 that's out in the atmosphere.
Right.
The real issue is that of realism. So, in other words, are we being naive to think that pursuing the five compassions is going to lead to change? Because, one of the things that I think you kind of start to allude to, but really didn't go into too much, is the underlying economic and political interest. And these are powerful because they're ultimately industry driven. These industries, ag is just one of many, are harming the environment. And
Mm.
as long as it remains profitable, as long as continues to lobby and apply capital and have political muscle behind it to protect their interests, nothing's really going to change, no matter the kind of compassion or the self-awareness that we have. So how do we address this?
Well, that's in my book again, how compassionate activism builds. Like right now, again, when you see with the student strikes and stuff in Europe, the masses of people on the street, compassion and change starts from below. But uh, in my final chapter, which is compassion for democracy, it's how by electing enlightened political leaders. For example, first you have to provide government with a plan. If they don't have one, you need to provide one, like the new Green New Deal. And when there's an election, you need for candidates to be able to state very clearly whether they're for or against these things, and you vote for them accordingly, irregardless of party, irregardless of club. Right now, like you mentioned, like money rules American democracy, and part of my chapter is about how our democracy has been eroded, with this basically politicians being bought and sold and coerced by the donations they have to be able to run for office. So the solutions really are through our government, and a strong, healthy government, and a well-run government, and with vision. The vision can be supplied from underneath, but we need basically policy change from our government. I think also, like I mentioned, corporations that don't join the $26 trillion new economy, and I write about that at length in the book, like what that is. And it's not just regenerative agriculture, but it's green buildings and all the other carbon reducing technologies. It's so important to join that economy, and corporations have a choice now to evolve and kind of get with it, and they're very wealthy and they can do that, or they have to be leveraged to kind of make those changes through legislation. And I think legislation is very possible. At one point we did the New Deal and rescued this country out of a depression and really changed American society in a fundamental way that exists to this day. And I think we can do the very same thing. And I think when I see the polls and the numbers, the majority of people support these type of ideas. And I'm very happy it's an election year right now too, as well. I think it's time for some positive change that could happen.
So one of the things that I'm hearing as a common theme, a recurring theme, is that you are advocating for specifically policy and legislation through the government, through the elective officials. Yet, I think from a kind of a pragmatic sense is that we are very much in a populist, fragmented political system, not just in the US, but overseas as well as internationally. And we're starting to see that.
Mm.
And populism has really kind of fractured, how we look at policymaking. Is it right and is it smart and effective for us to look to policymakers when in fact their self-interest, regardless which party that they belong, are fundamentally misaligned with the benefit and protection of the environment? And it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat, Republican, or what party, as long as there's special interests involved, they're going to advocate or legislate on behalf of the protection of particular sectors. right? Um, and the other thing is, I think it's an important piece is that we have to give a fair perspective is not every solution has to be fiscal policy driven. The new Green Deal is a heavy-handed fiscal policy driven framework with questionable approach and execution. So that may or may not be the answer to all. So how do we look at this in a nonpartisan, in a kind of a open, transparent, balanced perspective that doesn't get trapped into the usual kind of conversations that happens on cable television?
Well, this is a fundamentally why when I mentioned that this issue is fundamentally nonpartisan. The first thing you say, well, how
Well,
about
hold on one
this?
second. I have to disagree with you because as soon as you bring up the term Green New Deal, it became immediately partisan. And that's why I'm asking for a response that gives a balanced perspective that does not have a preconceived notion or bias one way or another in terms of, Keynesian approach versus a neoclassical approach.
Hmm.
How do we look at this in such a way where it's not federally driven, federal government driven, but that is really both a kind of a multi-stakeholder, private public sector, as well as the individuals, that collectivism, and that collectivism doesn't just raise awareness and consciousness, but it actually translates into capital deployment, execution with the right technology to solve big problems. And how do we create the markets in such a way that you start to erode the profit margins from certain industries that are harming the environment and animal rights in such a way that systematically, you shift the power structure away from that to something more positive?
Well, that's happening right now. If you just look at, like, for example, the price of oil, but just um, consumers are increasingly reacting. Millennials and Gen Zs are very connected with not contributing to eating unhealthy food and contributing to or by purchasing or being a consumer of factory farm meat and stuff like that. So from the bottom up with consumers, there's an awful lot happening right now. I think that there's several reasons, though, when I say that it's nonpartisan. For example, like, there's such a pervasive fundamental lack of understanding of the immediacy and severity of catastrophic climate warming that basically among members of both the dominant political parties, this issue is nonpartisan because there's an incomplete understanding of the human cause of global warming among our political leaders. This issue is nonpartisan. I think because American farmers and farming communities have so much to gain from a reinvigoration of their economies through regenerative agriculture, this issue is nonpartisan. I think because growth and prosperity is a goal of both political parties, and being able to join the global $26 trillion new economy, I think that's a goal of both parties. So it's nonpartisan. And I think ultimately, because global warming is destroying our environment, it's soon jeopardizing our very survival. I mean, it's nonpartisan. I think also because the values residing in the hearts of every American, our compassion for our decency and love of the environment and our planet and I think our very humanity. I think because that's very important. I think that's fundamentally, again, this transcends political parties. It's a human issue and a human endeavor, and it's about creating awareness of our arch villain, of our solution, and through democracy, how you can mobilize this change. And that's really what the 5 compassions are all about.
Well, I think one of the things that's missing from the compassion, in my perspective, humbly, is greed. And as much as we like to believe that these are universal values, the reality is that the special interests in certain industries place greed and profit above any human compassion that transcends cultures and
Yes,
languages and
I agree.
geographies. So in the case of the institutional farming structure, really, I mean, right now, it's the micro family-owned farms that are exploited by the larger cooperatives, right?
Oh, they get
Um,
no subsidies. They get no help at all. All
it's
the
not even
subsidies go to
subsidies;
big
they're
ag.
essentially indentured slaves in many cases.
Yeah.
So how do the question that, just so you know, just to be very clear, is I'm equally frustrated with you. I'm not against you. Is
Mm.
that how do we actually dismantle some of these institutions that are in place firmly, and the control and the power structure are not in a position where they're going to yield because they don't want to give up the profits, they don't want to give up the control and interest. Because until the individual family farms are really the dominant players, it's not going to happen. And as far as the way that it's currently structured, it's not looking that it's going to happen anytime soon.
Right. Well, the answer to that, I think, is, again, with the new Farm Bill, for example. Like the Farm Bill, really, it determines how agriculture is done in this country. And all the subsidies go to the factory farms and industrial agriculture, and smaller farmers don't get anything. And they get no bank loans or anything else because they're deemed high risk, which they're really not. So that policy, we have to scrap the new Farm Bill and completely shift those incentives for a complete shift to regenerative agriculture. Now, at one point, Big Ag, I think they all know their system is untenable and it's destroying the earth. They know that the factory farms are environmental catastrophes. And we see it right now with the meat problems with the COVID epidemic and the meat chain right now. They know they've got to change, so they have a choice. They can get on board and actually embrace change. For example, the fossil fuel industry could start to open their own wind farms and everything else and really dive in a big way. But right now they're not resistant. I think the Big Ag could do actually the same thing, but say they don't. Say they're resolutely intractable until basically the earth tells us we have to stop. Well, in that case, because of greed and profit, in that case, it comes down to legislation like the New Deal and a new farm bill which shifts those incentives. So you subsidize humane and ethical treatment of animals, pastured animals, and also, again, regenerative farming, small family farms. One of this, I travel across the country, and everywhere you go, all of our rural communities are just impoverished. It's just poverty.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Highest
suicide rate. And I apologize. We need to wrap up here. Is that I wish that it was as easy as changing a bill, but the reality is those that are authoring the bills and those that are actually in a position of running agencies, deputy or director level, are the ones that are been appointed, and oftentimes they are actually, in fact, the very industries that you're trying to protect others from.
Yeah.
So today I've been joined by Stephen Erickson, who is an environmental and animal activist, who is also the author of The Great Healing, 5 Compassions That Can Save Our World. Thank you for joining today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, pleasure, Scott. Thank you very much for having me.